Hello and welcome to PFF at Night. I'm Doug Kyed, joined as always by Meirov and Brad Spielberger. Let's get right into it. We've been waiting to hear about the Deshaun Watson suspension for weeks, months now at this point. Finally came out before 9 a.m. this morning. Deshaun Watson will be suspended 6 games. That came down from Sue L. Robinson, the judge presiding over this case, the neutral arbitrator between the NFL and the NFLPA. And I would just say that let's give our initial takeaways off of this decision. And my first takeaway is just that I was expecting more games than this. I was even expecting probably only 2 more games. I was expecting something like an 8-game suspension. It's certainly a far cry from what we were talking about weeks and months ago about a full season suspension. That's what the NFL wanted for this Deshaun Watson suspension. But Ari, I'll start off with you. What was just your initial reaction to this news?
Yeah, when we found out yesterday that this was finally going to go down on Monday morning, the way I sensed everything was that if it's 4 or less, 1 to 4, the NFL is for sure going to appeal. If it's 8 or more, I think they'll be fine with sticking with it. If it's 5, 6, or 7, I think the NFL is stuck not knowing what to do. And that's where we are right now. They're at 6, where it feels like it really isn't enough considering everything that's been reported that is known, and really what Sue L. Robinson put in her 15-page document where she basically mentions that Mr. Watson, his pattern of conduct is the most egregious than any before reviewed in the NFL's history of the personal conduct policy. And here we are with a 6-game suspension. So we're in a bit of a situation right now where I don't think the NFL is comfortable with the number. We know they argued for a full season. It's far less than that. And they're in a situation right now where they have these next 3 days where they are allowed to appeal it. And if it gets appealed, it goes to Commissioner Roger Goodell, and then he could add games. And from there, I'm sure we'll have more discussions on this. That's where it could get very interesting, could definitely prolong far longer than we actually anticipated.
As I said at the beginning, I did expect it to be 8 games. I guess we probably should have seen this coming last night to some degree when the NFLPA got out ahead of things and said that they were not going to appeal this decision. They were calling on the NFL to do the same thing. Mario, like you mentioned, the NFL now has 3 days to decide whether they want to appeal the suspension or not. But Brad, what was your initial takeaway here?
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway was in that concluding page that Judge Robinson put forward, and she's a judge, and you can tell. And I think this is what the 2 sides agreed to, and more so what the NFLPA wanted was, as opposed to some arbitrary handling. Look, Roger Goodell is probably a business savant, but he is not an attorney, and him being the judge, jury, and executioner of the prior policy was something the players took a lot of issue with and fought for in the CBA. And she plainly stated, you're trying to impose a punishment that is not in line with past precedent. You mentioned Ben Roethlisberger got a 6-game with the ability to reduce down to 4, did reduce it down to 4. Ezekiel Elliott, also a similar situation, sexual misconduct, no formal charges filed, also got a 6-game suspension, took that all the way to the federal appeals court after actually winning in district court and then losing in appeals court and ultimately serving those 6 games. But she was strong in her language, saying, this comes out of nowhere, and based on how courts, handle these processes, I see no reason why it should be an indefinite suspension or a season-long suspension and all these things. So I think it certainly works in the NFLPA's favor. The commissioner or the NFL league office has 3 days to file an appeal now to himself. Or to another appointed individual. But I think, who are you going to appoint? And you're going to just undermine this new disciplinary officer that you just added in 2020. Yeah, like Ari said, I think it clearly is a tough middle ground potentially for the NFL, but could get very sticky if they do decide to progress and push for more discipline.
Yeah, I have no idea which way the NFL is ultimately going to go with this, because they are avoiding some criticism. I'm sure they have received some criticism based on this decision, but they were arguing for a full season suspension for Deshaun Watson. Yes, you could certainly make the case that if they don't appeal this, then they aren't fighting hard enough to get that full season suspension. But Sue L. Robinson decided that Deshaun Watson violated 3 provisions of the personal conduct policy. I'm just going to read through them real quick. Number 1 was sexual assault. Number 2 was conduct that poses a genuine danger to the safety and well-being of another person. Number 3 was conduct that undermines or puts at risk the integrity of the NFL. One note that I think has been picked apart a little bit in her ruling, which I think to some degree, the wording, disagreeing with it is probably fair. Maybe also the way that it was reported is partially the reason why this has been picked apart. But she did write that it is undisputed that Mr. Watson's conduct does not fall into the category of violent conduct that would require the minimum 6-game suspension. Just wanted to point out a tweet from one of my friends, Charlotte Wilder, who works at Fox Sports. She wrote, any form of what this refers to as sexual assault that isn't completely consensual is a form of violence. So the basis of any argument for the absurdly weak suspension is completely false and very dangerous. I think that ultimately this needed to probably be worded better, or it didn't, maybe like they needed to firmly define violence in this, because what Sue L. Robinson was ultimately determining is that it didn't reach a violent, she was going by certain policies of the NFL conduct policy, and violence referred to, non-sexual assault, like something like, assault and battery, something to that degree. I think that maybe the definitions of violence need to be better asserted in this or something, because I do think it's a fair criticism of the ruling that, yes, anything regarding this is in nature violent. But that was just one thing that was kind of picked apart, and I thought it was fair, and it probably need to be either reported on a little bit better or just worded a little bit differently. But Ari, I'll kick this to you. With this appeal process, if the NFL does decide to appeal, then, if Roger Goodell initially wanted a full season suspension for Deshaun Watson, then what's stopping him from just giving him that full season suspension? What would happen at that point?
Yeah, let's take a step back first and just understand why the system is even in place, because this thing came into place in the 2020 CBA. It was something that both sides were okay with. From the union side, they were basically just sick and tired of the NFL being the ones determining what the discipline is without evidence, with evidence. It was really just up to Roger Goodell, and he would make a decision. From the NFL side, there were people who didn't like the fact that they were essentially like an FBI team doing investigations and making decisions. I mean, I think the one that is very well known was Jerry Jones with Ezekiel Elliott was really upset with Roger Goodell and the way he handled all of that. So having someone in the middle is something both sides are okay with. The caveat, as you mentioned, Doug, is that Roger Goodell is still the appeals officer for personal conduct discipline. So if any side wants to appeal, it goes to Roger Goodell or his designee, and Roger Goodell from there would make a determination of a discipline. So in this case, if the NFL were to appeal this thing, it would go to Roger Goodell, and he could essentially do whatever they want and put any amount of games that he feels is the right amount of games. So the NFL wanted a full season. He could technically do a full season. The problem with doing that is the NFLPA then has 2 days to respond to that. And this thing could eventually end up going to district court. And we've seen that happen with Ezekiel Elliott. We've seen it happen with Tom Brady. And whenever that happens, we've seen times where usually the NFL has prevailed in court. But what this does is that it essentially stretches everything out. And Deshaun Watson could essentially possibly be playing in week 1, 2, 3 while all of this is playing out in court and we wait for a final decision. So I feel like that, and one of the reasons why the NFL might look into this and not appeal this, is that essentially this will be overshadowing the entire start of the season, the entire kickoff week, weeks 1, 2, and 3. Deshaun Watson is on the field, and he will be the main topic of conversation around the NFL if it gets to this territory. So that is really one of the things that the NFL is trying to balance out right now, is that if they do appeal, and let's just say they go to 10, 12, or even a full season, the NFLPA could easily strike back at them and eventually prolong this thing and essentially allow Deshaun Watson to play to start the season, and eventually we'll have a discipline come down through the courts. but he's going to be playing to start the year. And I think that might be the worst outcome for everybody, for the image of the league, and just having him on the field while all this is still playing out. You can imagine all the storylines, not just in the NFL world, but you could have all the CNNs and Fox News and all those different people talking about this as well, which is the one thing the NFL definitely does not want. So there's a bit of a balancing act here that the NFL has to go through in determining if they're going to appeal this or not.
Yeah, as it stands right now, Deshaun Watson can participate in training camp. He can play during the preseason. He's set to be suspended the first 6 weeks of the season. That's against the Panthers, Jets, Steelers, Falcons, Chargers, and Patriots. And I do think that's a really good point. I think that, by pushing this decision off as far as it was pushed, I feel like this probably actually would have been a bigger story, the actual determination of the suspension, the amount of games, if it happened 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, obviously not over the July 4th or something like that, but when it was more fresh in people's minds. I think people have almost reached an overexposure portion to this where they're kind of sick of thinking about it, sick of talking about it. It's still obviously a massive story, but if the NFL does appeal this, then as you said, it just prolongs the story, carries into the regular season. Potentially Deshaun Watson possibly plays through the first 6 weeks, and this could even go on into 2023 the way they did with Tom Brady. If you remember with him, he was suspended for the 2015 season. It went to court and he didn't actually serve that suspension until 2016. So I don't think that the NFL still wants people to be talking about Deshaun Watson in 2023. Obviously, they wanted a full season suspension, but if it comes with bad PR, if it comes with, people continuing to talk about things that they don't want to be talking about, then yeah, maybe it's not in their best interest to appeal this. Brad, how do you think this all shakes out?
Yeah, I think all that's correct. Ezekiel Elliott also played football during his appeals process, and it creates this awkward dynamic. I think a couple other notes that are important as well. Again, just going back to the fact that Sue Robinson effectively, wrote an opinion today. She mentioned specifically, I assume, alluding to the Ray Rice scandal, how, again, if you're going to view this as we have precedent based on the evidence in front of us, then it should be a 6-game suspension, not media outrage, I think is the term she used. Again, I'm using her words, but essentially it kind of precludes the NFL from then trying to extend the suspension and say, what's your basis? Is your rationale that you saw a lot of bad tweets on Twitter and people are upset, which again, it matters and public discourse matters and people have every right to be upset, but that doesn't really tie into your ability to suspend someone and take their money away under this personal conduct policy. So there's so many layers to this and ways that an appeal has already kind of been written a little bit by Sue Robinson, not only laying out why she landed where she landed, but each step she took to get there that makes arguments a bit harder going forward.
Yeah, I would just add also that if the NFL was to appeal, they have to go based off Judge Sue L. Robinson's evidence. Like, they cannot bring in new evidence into the picture and work off of that. So the NFL initially, there were 20 plus women who accused Deshaun Watson in civil lawsuits. The NFL only brought 5 cases to Sue Robinson, and one of those were dropped because the NFL didn't interview one of those individuals. So if they're going to appeal this, they have to go based off the 15-page document that Sue L. Robinson brought in. They can start bringing in other women who are not involved initially whenever they brought in all of this with Sue L. Robinson. I think that's another part of this that is very noteworthy. They have to work based off what Sue L. Robinson has in her 15-page document.
Right. It's 4 cases, not, everyone's mentioning this 30 number, which of course is what happened in reality. But this case is based on 4 cases. Ben Roethlisberger back in the day actually had 2 accusations, but the case was based on one of those accusations. The other one was ignored for this specific policy. That is an important note. And
it does feel like the NFL did bring forth, 4 of the therapist or the massage therapists who were I guess negatively impacted. Like, it's not as if they were bringing in 4 masseuses who weren't negatively impacted by this. It does seem like they were certainly negatively impacted by everything that went on. It's not like they were. Yeah, I think that they did take this very seriously. It's not like they picked out 4 masseuses who were for Deshaun Watson or didn't have strong cases or anything like that. So no, certainly going to be curious to see what the NFL does, how they handle this. But time is of the essence. They have 3 days to do this. And for the Browns, obviously we said there could be a situation where Deshaun Watson could play the first 6 weeks of the season. But, if the NFL appeals and Roger Goodell says that it should be a full season suspension, then the Browns would then have to be scrambling for a quarterback again, if it comes down to that and it doesn't go to federal court. So, this feels over. It's not fully over until the NFL decides whether or not to appeal. But let's talk about this a little bit from a football perspective, because as I mentioned, 6-game suspension for Deshaun Watson. Jacoby Brissett will be the Browns starting quarterback for those 6 games. It certainly does not feel like they now need to scramble for a different starting quarterback. So, Ari, how do you feel like the Browns are going to look, at least for the first 6 weeks of the season, if this suspension does not get pushed forward into 2023?
Yeah, we've had discussions about this on the show in previous episodes, where if it is a lengthy suspension, do the Browns stick with Jacoby Brissett or look for somebody else like a Jimmy Garoppolo? If this is a 6-game suspension, I think they're more than comfortable with going with Jacoby Brissett for those games and eventually having Deshaun Watson coming in, assuming all the appeal stuff doesn't happen. But point is, they are perfectly fine with that. And really, when you look at the Browns' schedule for the first 6 games, they have the easiest schedule in the league in terms of strength of schedule. When you look at the Panthers, the Jets, the Steelers, the Falcons, and the Chargers and Patriots, get a little bit more difficult from there. But I think you make a pretty strong argument that with Jacoby Brissett as your quarterback, who started 5 games last year for the Dolphins, graded pretty well here at PFF. I believe it was over 75 in those 5 starts. With that roster, which is very stacked, you can make a good argument for 3-3, 4-2 based off those games. I mean, these are very winnable games against those opponents. So in a way, just looking at the Browns and their schedule and Jacoby Brissett, who is a capable quarterback, maybe not for a full year, but for the short term, I think this is a scenario for the Browns. When we're talking about football only, this could possibly be the best case scenario for them, considering their roster right now.
Yeah, it certainly seems feasible that they would beat the Jets, Steelers, and Falcons there in the middle of that schedule. It could be facing Baker Mayfield in week 1. That makes things a little bit tricky. And then, as you mentioned, the Chargers gets difficult, and we'll see how the Patriots fare this season. But those last 2 games definitely do look a little bit more difficult in that schedule. But Brad, how do you feel about Josh Rosen or Joshua Dobbs being the backup to Jacoby Brissett through those first 6 games of the season?
Yeah, I mean, of course, an injury to Brissett would be a disaster. I do think it's important to point out, too, they acquired Brissett this offseason and moved on from Case Keenum. So it's a new backup that they went out and acquired and clearly believe in, have a lot of faith in going forward. So at this point with a 6-game suspension, I would be surprised if he is supplanted as the starter, especially because we're now in August. So his knowledge of the playbook and his chemistry with the teammates is probably ahead of a guy you hypothetically bring in and then try to get all that up to speed. They may look for another backup because, Rosen and Josh Dobbs, do not have a lot of NFL experience, but I would be surprised if we do not see Jacoby Brissett start the first 6 weeks if he can stay healthy.
Yeah, Jacoby Brissett, one of the top backup quarterbacks in the NFL, not an ideal starter, but for a 6-game stretch, certainly not the worst thing. Let's get into another topic here. Deebo Samuel signed a 3-year contract extension, 3 years up to $73.5 million. Brad, how does this contract compare to some of the other deals that we've seen wide receivers sign this offseason?
Yeah, so this group of 4 guys now, and A.J. Brown, Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf, and now Deebo Samuel, all pretty similar through the first 3 years. Samuel is up there with Metcalf after 3 years in terms of the cash he actually gets, but Metcalf's first 2 years, just because of the way the Seahawks structured deals, is remarkably strong. But nevertheless, a great deal, and I thought an important note, an interesting note that just came out from Adam Schefter before we hopped on, the incentives that could push it to 73.5 are specifically tied to rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. And I think it may be presented as Deebo Samuel and his camp being smart to get compensation for him having to run the football. But in total, it's less than $2 million. And you could also argue from the 49ers standpoint, they now, when they give him a carry, can say, well, you can make money off of this carry, so you should be happy about it. It's a chance to earn some more extra cash in your pocket, even though all things considered, it's a pretty insignificant amount compared to the base value of the deal.
Yeah, I believe it's $650,000 for 380 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns per season, I believe it is. I mean, from a 49ers perspective, that's a pretty fair salary for a backup third string running back, the type of player who put up those numbers. And for Deebo Samuel, and if he does hit those numbers, then he's essentially earning a second salary as kind of a backup running back. I'm not sure if that's the exact way that they want to look at it, but Ari, what was your reaction to this deal?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to know really just what happened that he initially requested the trade, because now that we know that there is a rushing incentive to basically match the stats from last year, which essentially means that he's okay doing it. And if it does happen, at least he gets rewarded for it. But really, I hope he does speak to the media here at some point just to elaborate exactly what happened a few months ago and how everything finally got resolved. But obviously, this is the best case scenario for San Francisco, for the new quarterback in Trey Lance, who in a couple of games when he did play last year, really played really well with Deebo Samuel. I believe he had 2 touchdowns, 10 receptions with him in those couple of games that he did play in. And I guess we could just give him a bit of a agent shout out. I mean, what Tory Dandy has done this offseason, the amount of money that he's brought in for his clients, from Mike Williams, Chris Godwin, Hassan Reddick, Denzel Ward, DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, now Deebo Samuel, also got Marquise Brown out of Baltimore into Arizona. He's had a busy offseason, caps it off now with this mega 3-year deal, which is obviously great for the player, for Deebo Samuel.
Certainly don't know if this is the exact reason that he rescinded that trade request, but wide receiver salaries exploded after that trade request. And some of that kind of started, at least in his draft year, with the deal that AJ Brown got after he was traded to the Philadelphia Eagles. So, an extra $4 or $5 million per year certainly doesn't hurt to stick around in San Francisco. More contract news. Orlando Brown reporting to camp, going to play on the franchise tag with the Kansas City Chiefs. I would say that this resolved itself faster than I expected it to. Brad, what were your thoughts on this news this morning?
Yeah, 100%. I think he may have looked around and realized that his holdout was probably not going to benefit him. Possibility he was rusty coming into week 1, and he's trying to play on this 1-year deal and earn that mega extension he clearly believes he deserves. But I agree. I thought this was going to extend much longer, potentially into the regular season. I do think that could be the case with Cincinnati Bengals safety Jesse Bates. But Brown clearly, I think he kind of took a step back, examined his situation, and I think probably made the correct decision. I don't think he would have benefited himself at all by staying away. If anything, I think other teams, you're trying to hit the open market and it's not the Chiefs. What other teams value you more than the team that already gave up a first-round pick to go out and acquire you? I think he made the correct decision here.
We had also talked about some of the potential options that the Chiefs had at left tackle if Orlando Brown did stay away. One of those was Joe Thuney, who filled in pretty well at left tackle last year for the Kansas City Chiefs, had filled in at other positions in the past for the New England Patriots. But Ari, does this impact Jesse Bates at all? Is there, what happens with Bates at this point, and were you surprised that Orlando Brown, I wouldn't say folded so quickly, but decided to play so quickly?
Yeah, I think we mentioned this on the show a couple of weeks ago that Orlando Brown, nobody really knows exactly what he's thinking. I mean, we had this in Baltimore when he made the pivot from right to left tackle. Was that a serious thing? Was it not? Baltimore believed it was, so they traded him. He gets moved to Kansas City, doesn't really have an agent, and finally hires an agent, but someone that nobody has any history with him. So we really didn't know, was he serious about a holdout? Would he actually take this into the season? And eventually he comes in before the first official day of padded practice. So, obviously great for everyone in Kansas City that he's there. He'll play on the 1-year, $16.6 million fully guaranteed tag this year. As for Jesse Bates, a little bit of a different situation for him, similar in that he has still not signed his franchise tag tender, so he cannot be fined for not being at training camp. But I would not be surprised if that one actually goes until the end of training camp. I mean, this is somebody who has been there his entire career, is the leader of that defense, has basically already said that he'll probably take this to the very end. And I just don't really see a reason for him to even be there as someone who has basically knows the defense. And again, he's basically made this clear from the beginning that this has been an ongoing problem for over a year now. This is his way of showing the team, yeah, I'm pretty pissed off for now. I'll show up when it's time to be, when it's time to play. But for now, I'm away and deal with it.
There are now 3 remaining hold-ins after Deebo Samuel signed his contract extension. Those would be Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver Deontay Johnson, Chicago Bears linebacker Roquan Smith, and Los Angeles Chargers safety Derwin James. I find the Deontay Johnson situation fascinating myself, just because he's a very good wide receiver. He's been very productive with the Steelers, but the Steelers do a very good job of finding young, talented wide receivers. And up to this point, Deontay Johnson probably has not done enough to earn a contract similar to the ones that, AJ Brown, Deebo Samuel, Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf have just signed. So it feels like that could be a difficult situation for the Steelers to resolve and to find the right figure for Deontay Johnson. But at this point, he's not doing a whole lot in practice. He's catching some passes from quarterbacks, but otherwise has not been, participating much in practice. Brad, what's a hold-in that you're monitoring right now?
Yeah, just real quick. Also, George Pickens might be one of the training camp highlight leaders so far. So that certainly does not work in Deontay Johnson's favor.
They've got Chase Claypool. Yeah, they've got a good wide receiver core already.
No doubt about it. Yeah. So, I'll go back to Chicago and linebacker Roquan Smith. Bit of a different scenario. They do not have a lot of linebacker depth on that team, but, he's still holding in. Head coach Matt Eberflus said he's been involved and active in all their meetings. He is the leader of that defense as well. Calls the plays, gets everyone in line. He's a very important part of that defense. But sounds like the hold-in is ongoing, and there does not seem to be a ton of optimism that this deal gets done soon. I think similar to Deontay Johnson, and something that's a bit underrated is, for both scenarios, you're kind of buying high, right? The wide receiver market has exploded. Maybe Pittsburgh would say, this was last offseason, and we could give you $18 million per year, like a Kenny Golladay or something like that. We'd be more interested, whereas Deontay Johnson's probably asking for, or if not, has the right to ask for over $20 million per year. I think with Roquan Smith in Chicago, it's a similar issue where Fred Warner and Darius Leonard just exploded this linebacker market in the near $20 million per year range. And I'm just not certain the Chicago Bears are comfortable going that high on their cornerstone defensive player.
And Aria, what do you see happening with Derwin James in the near future here?
Yeah, unlike Deontay Johnson and Roquan Smith, I think this one is at the very least getting close to getting done there in LA with Derwin James. I feel like we've sensed that for the last couple of weeks, and it sounds like it's only getting closer and closer. I would not be surprised if it gets done by the end of the week and he'll be back on the practice field. That's definitely what the sense is coming out of LA. Brandon Staley has mentioned that Derwin James is not on the field, but you could tell that he's showing a little bit of excitement on the sidelines. You could tell that he knows this thing is getting close to getting done. So I would not be surprised at all if this one gets done here in the near future.
One slightly different thing about the Roquan Smith situation is that he is actually still on the PUP list, whereas the other guys are not. So that gives him a little bit more of an excuse not to be practicing right now. Speaking of the PUP list, let's go around, wrap around with one more thing that we're monitoring around the NFL. For me personally, it's players that are on the PUP list, players who are coming off of the PUP list. I'm writing something tomorrow, giving an update on a lot of those guys who are injured around the NFL. But I thought it was notable today how many guys came off the PUP list. I think some of that is that the pads are coming on for NFL teams right now. This was the first day that a lot of teams were permitted to have a padded practice. I think that kind of accelerates the timeline on some of these guys. So I was at Patriots practice today. They had Jabril Peppers, Jonathan Jones, and Miles Bryant all return to practice, but elsewhere around the NFL, Panthers cornerback J.C. Horn came off the PUP list. You saw Saints linebacker Pete Werner. You saw Browns right tackle Jack Conklin. You also saw Broncos wide receiver KJ Hamler. All of these guys are now coming off the PUP list. So I think that this will continue. Most of these situations are not overly severe. One definitely to monitor is Chase Young with the Washington Commanders. Seems like he could potentially miss week one. Commanders head coach Ron Rivera was a little bit hesitant to put it beyond that date, but he did say that he probably doesn't expect him to play in week one. But there's some other guys around the NFL, La'el Collins, Randy Gregory, who should be coming off the PUP list relatively soon and should be able to start practicing with their new teams. Brad, what's one more thing that you're monitoring around the NFL?
Yeah, well, it might be an addition, unfortunately, and the Cowboys already have wide receiver Michael Gallup fresh off his extension. It looks like other wide receiver in recent addition, James Washington, the former Pittsburgh Steeler, was hurt today in practice. There's apparently reports he may have a Jones fracture in his foot, which is, of course, not a good injury for any position, but, of course, a wide receiver. They're already down a lot of bodies. Obviously, Cedric Wilson and Amari Cooper left this offseason. CeeDee Lamb is the guy there, and is, by all accounts, good to go. Dalton Schultz is in practice, on his franchise tag. But another potential injury at wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys. They did add some players in the draft, but they could be looking to maybe give a call to Odell Beckham Jr. or somebody else to bolster that room, just at least in the early part of the season.
And Brad, one more thing on the Chicago Bears as well. Tevin Jenkins involved in some trade talks. What can you tell us about that?
Yes. So there was a report yesterday from David Kaplan. I believe NBC Sports Chicago, I believe. I apologize if I'm incorrect in that, but saying that not only is there maybe some nagging injuries, he had a back surgery last year in his rookie season. The Bears traded up to the 39th overall pick in the draft to take him last year, but also reported there are immaturity issues and that Chris Morgan, the offensive line coach, and Tevin Jenkins do not see eye to eye. There are issues there with him and the entire coaching staff. And a report from Ian Rappaport of NFL Media Today states the Bears have had conversations about a potential trade of Tevin Jenkins. Maybe some other teams believe in his potential. Like I said, just 1 year into his career, had a back surgery and dealt with COVID, and still played a little bit at the end of the season. But it sounds like there is a lot of issues there, and he may be on the way out just 1 year into his career after being the 39th overall pick in the draft.
And that's something that you sometimes see with these new regimes where they will, immediately trade a draft pick from the old regime. We saw it last year with CJ Henderson going from the Jaguars to the Carolina Panthers. Could see something similar with Tevin Jenkins. Ari, Brad just mentioned COVID. COVID is not gone in the NFL. We avoided it for about a week, but it's reared its ugly head again today.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of gone because there's no longer testing every single day or every 5 days or whatever it is, but players could still self-report if they feel like something is wrong with them. And we had that happen today with Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray. Self-reported, he might not be feeling well, tested for COVID, and he tested positive. And I think it's just noteworthy that people know the rules now with the COVID going into this year, that if you are testing positive, you must isolate for at least 5 days, which is basically consistent with what the CDC guidelines are. So I think that's definitely one just to remind yourself when the season comes along, if there are any COVID positives. We also had Seattle Seahawks head coach Pete Carroll, who is the oldest head coach in the NFL. He tested positive as well. He's fully vaccinated. In a statement, the team said that he's at home and he's doing well, and he will be doing stuff virtually with the team until he feels better and is no longer positive. So best wishes to him.
Yeah, it's obviously best for those teams that they're getting this out of the way early in training camp rather than during the season. But it is just a reminder that this could certainly happen during the regular season. It probably won't happen to the same degree that it did in previous years when players had to be testing every single day. But we certainly could see players miss a game due to COVID if they do have to miss 5 days after testing positive. That will do it for this week's or today's PFF at Night. We will be back with you guys again on Wednesday, so keep it on pff.com for all of your news and analysis. Follow Ari on Twitter at MySportsUpdate. Follow Brad on Twitter at PFF_Brad. Follow me on Twitter at Doug Kyed, and check out that piece on guys coming off the pup list that I promoted earlier. That's coming out tomorrow morning.